Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to have you all here today. Um, today, Kelly and I are here. Kelly and I actually met just through, I think, another networking thing, and she does brand and marketing, and I do training. And we realized that a lot of the things that, especially when it comes to product adoption, are very common both in her work and my work. And so we thought, hey, it's a great opportunity to collaborate and just share more about what we do, but also how we work to help companies in building that product adoption ecosystem. Because for both of us, our goal really is to help company turn those users into product champions and advocates. And so that is how this presentation came about. And feel free to, the chat's open. So if you would like to connect with others on this chat, feel free to drop in your name, where you're calling in from, and also your LinkedIn so you can keep in touch. All right, Kelly, take it away.
Okay, so as Muncie said, we came together because um, from a perspective of somebody working in brand and marketing for health tech companies and for somebody working in training and education, we see this scenario often. And I think also for people who are working in health tech or building a health tech business, maybe you don't recognize that this problem that might be germane to you is actually something more universal. And the common scenario is that we deal with a lot of companies who have passed clinical validation and they've actually even closed some pilots. They might have had, as much as 10 pilots closed. But at the end of the day, what they start to realize is that even though people have bought into their vision and are excited about the product, there's very few that are actually using the product. And that is a challenge that when I meet clients, that's a common problem they're dealing with. And when Monty meets clients, that's a very common problem they're dealing with.
And another thing that we see is that when they come to us, they talk about the product and working with key opinion leaders or subject matter experts, and they talk about how subject matter experts or those key opinion leaders love the product and totally bought into the vision, but they're having a hard time convincing their peers about the product and having peers buy into the vision and the importance of why that product adds value.
So the fact of the matter is, it's an inconvenient truth that even though people might be very interested in your product, they might be very excited about it, they might see it as a solution for their own business or organization, it doesn't necessarily translate to product adoption on its own.
And so, really, when you have a strong product, that's what sparks interest. But like Kelly said, it won't drive adoption. So, what it comes down to is people commit to the product when they understand what you offer, how it fits into their workflow, and how it adds value to them. And so, if they're not able to see that, that's what delays that product adoption.
So the other element that we see in sort of an inconvenient truth that actually often creates this lack of product adoption is that we see a lot of early stage startups building their businesses in silos. So they might start with product development and then they move on to business development. Then they might start thinking about brand and marketing. And then after that, they start thinking about training and education. But it's actually a more effective tool to get more adoption and to scale more effectively. You need to bring all of these different aspects of your business together much earlier on than you might think.
Yeah. And so part of the work that we do, and like I mentioned, this is how Kelly and my collaboration came about, is talking about that ecosystem. Because when you, instead of working in silos, when you start working in an ecosystem, um, the information flows from each of the different departments. And that when the teams start collaborating, that's what elevates the brand and increases to business growth or leads to business growth. Oh, sorry. There you go. So, part of why we're here today is talking about that importance of that adoption ecosystem. So when product development is speaking to business development, they're also sharing their insights with brand and marketing. They're also thinking about training and education all together. That is what engages, that nurtures the clients. And that is what comes through to the customers because you're able to talk about that customer journey, and you're able to translate and move the customer from not knowing anything about the product to becoming curious to then becoming that product advocate.
And what I see oftentimes is that companies who've built that adoption ecosystem have a very strong backbone for predictable growth in healthcare. So, our goal today is to talk about why that ecosystem matters, but also to give you some direction in how to start building an adoption ecosystem, no matter your stage of business development.
So why does it matter? It matters because you start with, branding and marketing. That is what allows you to strengthen your brand. And then from that, then you align your marketing and messaging. When you have that, you are then able to build your training. And then from when you have a cohesive training, you're then able to transform customers into your advocates. And that is what ultimately leads to accelerate that adoption. And so everything is feeding into each other essentially. So I want to take a minute and just talk about who Kelly and I are. So my name's Mansi, and I'm an education and training consultant. I'm the founder of Sefrella. And what I do is I work with companies as they're scaling to essentially bring those customers from not knowing anything about the product to becoming those product champions. And so I really help build that training systems in place so that you're supporting the customer in their journey. And also internally, as you're scaling, I help companies align their teams so that the teams are then aligned internally to then know how to show up for the customer and talk about the product and how it supports the customer in their workflow. And I have 20 years of experience. I've worked at companies like Medtronic, Intuitive Surgical, and I've also worked at several healthcare startups.
And my name is Kelly McDonald. I am the creative director and a healthcare brand strategist at Bravetail. We work with a lot of growing tech businesses, especially in healthcare. And oftentimes we are hired by either in-house marketing teams or founders who are trying to evolve their business from that scrappy startup stage into a more enterprise level business and brand. So we often find ourselves at a position where we're talking to different stakeholders in the company. And oftentimes we ask to speak to the patient liaisons or education leads because more often than not, what they've learned from interacting with the end user will inform how a company is going to evolve their brand and evolve their marketing and by extension their sales to get that next to get to that next position of growth. So, and we find that the clients we have who've built out that ecosystem very early on where stakeholders are talking to each other, they tend to raise more money. They tend to retain more customers, not because they're special or unicorns or anything like that, but because they understand the value of their teams working and communicating together to build out a brand and by extension, a robust business. So kind of leading into that, we observe two kinds of companies and how they build out their business structure. Company one tends to be, I see this a lot, especially with first time founders. And it's very common amongst science founders that you build out your business in this sort of linear path. So you might validate your concept, build out your product, and then go through clinical trials. And I understand the vital importance of that in healthcare. But what ends up happening is sales and marketing and training become kind of an afterthought. And a lot of the information that people get in that product development stage and that clinical trial stage gets lost. And it's unfortunate because sales, training, marketing, and brand could use that information to build out a really strong presence in the market.
And then in company two, which is implementing the ecosystem approach, so when they are doing that validation and that product testing, they're taking all those insights and thoughtfully translating and giving them to clinical, marketing, training, and sales. So in that process, as they're doing that validation and testing, each of the other teams is able to gather what they need to be able to better understand what's happening during that validation process and take those insights and then use it for their own. So for example, like brand and messaging will use those insights to develop your, what's the message, what's the, what are the users interested in, and then training will be able to gather like what were some of the friction points, how do we build that into training. So for each of the teams, having those insights is very important because then they're able to elevate the company and move things along.
So getting back to why we kind of want to emphasize the problems with the linear approach is that I find that we deal with a knowledge and entropy when it comes to the linear approach. So, um, especially at stages like product development and clinical trials, a lot of those teams are looking at their product through a very specific lens, but they're also accumulating information and knowledge that would be very valuable to people in training and sales. And it's important to remember that like sometimes a product dev person, if they're looking at UX, for example, or we're trying to deal with user experience, what they're thinking about when it comes to user experience is really important for the product itself. But what they're also, the information they're gathering for UX can be extremely valuable for somebody who's building out, a sales funnel or a marketing campaign. But it'll also help you develop the brand itself, like the personality of your business. If your business is kind of like your baby, and for a lot of founders it is, this is part of its growing up. This is part of its origin story. And so building out that brand, bringing out that personality of the business, it often happens in, product development, clinical trials, and even when we're testing out the MVP. And so if you're not documenting that and sharing that, it's sort of a shame because you lose out on a lot of really valuable intel that can be leveraged later on in your business's growth.
And then one of the other things that I see on my end is because founders are so focused on that validation and that development, training becomes an afterthought, and it's the last thing that they think about. So it only comes about when, oh, we're about to commercialize, and now we need to think about training. And what happens, I want to give an example, is there was a health tech company that I was working with. They brought me in because now they were about to commercialize and they wanted to build a onboarding program for their customers. So when I started working with them, so it was a software platform. Sales was calling it a tool, product was calling it a platform, and customer success was calling it a software. And you may think, oh, it's just a word, but it makes such a big difference in what the value of the product is. So when I started working with them, the first thing I did was, okay, let's everybody come together, let's align on what this product actually is, because based on that is what I can develop the training and show how it integrates into their workflow and the value that it brings. And so in that linear approach, when the teams are not speaking to each other, that's when you get these sort of fractures. But in the ecosystem, because they're communicating, they're able to align on, what is the product as well.
And kind of tying into that, companies who adopt an ecosystem approach have a very interesting way of also developing their business. So I have seen very successful companies almost start their business by asking, okay, we have this idea for a problem we're solving, but what is the business we're developing? And they will bring in marketing training, biz dev alongside product development and validation. So they have their stakeholders really early on talking about how they envision the business, what the problem they're trying to solve, who they think they're going to support through this solution. And when they do that at the very beginning or in the early stages of their business, they build this foundation and system that allows them to evolve and grow over time in a really effective way. So I have worked with a couple of companies where they're kind of B2B to C, where they're selling to a health provider or a healthcare system, but the end user is a patient. And they will very early on bring on patient advocates, and they will have those patient advocates talking to the marketing team, talking to the business development team, and talking to product development because they're learning about how the patient is actually using the tool. They're learning about the true value that the patient gets. Oftentimes, as your business evolves, the problem you think you're solving um, is not the problem that your customers value in your product. It's kind of interesting that way. And so your brand, your marketing, your sales, and your training is going to evolve. So when you build this ecosystem, it helps it evolve a lot faster. I'm right now working with a health tech company that I've worked with several times from they were like very, very early stages. Then they gained a lot of traction in the market. Now they're working for almost being like a market leader. And so their brand is being refined, their marketing strategy is being refined based on the information that they've learned from education and training. And by extension, their product, their V2, V3 of their product is evolving based on what we've learned from education and training.
So to what Kelly was saying, when having that ecosystem is what gives it that exponential growth. And so kind of what also we alluded to earlier is when you're doing that, let's say you're in the MVP testing phase, making sure that those insights are translated to product development and training so that you're truly understanding the user, you're understanding their experience, and you're able to evolve. And I know Kelly talked about this, so um, I just kind of wanted to reiterate that as well.
And from a brand and marketing perspective, understanding your customer is like an essential component of building out your brand. But I think that the other thing that people need to remember is that building out your brand and marketing is about building connections and alignment. So that means internal alignment amongst your team, which is what Monty had alluded to in terms of making sure that everybody is using the same terminology, the same words for their product. It's about creating alignment with your customers and then with the people that are using your product, which may or may not be your customer, depending on your health tech. So brand is about creating that whole picture and whole understanding and creating tools and strategies to create human connection. And so, again, that ecosystem approach gives you that high level perspective in order to create effective points of connection amongst your team members and with the public who you're trying to sell to.
Yeah. And in healthcare, training should be strategic and not an afterthought because at the end of the day, it's how you train your customer, whether the customer are clinicians, surgeons, patients, that is what builds trust. That's what builds safety. And also, it's important to show the workflow and how it impacts their workflow and makes their life easier. So, when training is incorporated early, it supports the customer journey, but it also boosts employee engagement because the employees understand the value of the product. They're also trained on the product, and then they're able to understand how do we then support our customer. So there's a study done in 2024 by Forrester Consulting that found for the companies that implement a customer education strategy, there's a 7.6% increase in revenue. So let's say you're closing 1 million in annual revenue, that's an additional $76,000 because you have a plan, essentially a customer journey of how you are going to support the customer along the way. And it increases product adoption by 38.3%. And so by thinking about training, you're able to naturally create those product advocates, especially early on, um, as you're growing your business or you've just gotten funding, because those advocates will then go on and be your champions and get other people to use your product.
So determining whether or not you have the infrastructure or the foundations of an ecosystem just requires about a 60-second audit. So for us, we always ask our clients, like, do you know who your ideal customer profile is? And do you know who your end user is? And by extension, does your team know that? Are they thinking about that? And by team, I mean everybody from product development, biz dev, sales, and marketing, obviously, but even your training team and your patient advocates. Does everybody know who you're really trying to target and what they need and what they want from you? The second is, do you have a consistent brand story? So that really means, like, are you all aligned on what your business, on the problem that your business solves for people? And is that communicated in your messaging on your website, in your general content, on your social media? But also, I would add to that, like, internally, does your team talk about your business in the same way? Because you would be amazed at how many people don't. And when they do, you'd be amazed at the end result, which is usually faster growth in a more efficient way.
And the next something to reflect on is, do you have that early training foundation, which means have you thought about the customer journey from when sales is just talking about the product or marketing is just creating that awareness to when you're creating that product champion? What does that journey look like? Do you have that mapped out? And then also documentation. Do you have documentation on what your product does? And it doesn't have to be anything complicated, like even just a Google Doc, or if you're in Confluence or somewhere where it's talking about, hey, this is what a product, this is what it's doing, this is the value that it's providing. That's also a great opportunity to come together. And then also for onboarding, onboarding is like the first thing that needs to be tackled. So it's onboarding for the customer. Do you have a process in place for what that looks like? And then also not just for your customers, but for your internal team. So as you're growing, do you have an onboarding process in place for your engineers or for your sales reps or for your customer success teams? What does that look like? And do you have a process for that? So that's also something to look at.
The other question is, are your teams somehow connected? So I've seen this again at the earliest stages. I've seen biz dev, the leads on biz dev, marketing, product development. It might just be the three people that's the company at that point, but they have a regular scheduled meeting or meetup to share information and lessons they've learned. And the companies that start this process and this sort of habit early really benefit overall, because they create this communication network that allows each department um, to really help each other out and also, like, push each other forward when it comes to product development, adoption, and market leadership.
Mhm. Yeah, and the certainly not the last, but one of the other things is learning loops. So gathering the feedback. So as you're growing and scaling, how are you gathering feedback? That's the first question to look into. And then how are you sharing it with your teams and the other departments so that you can align on improvement and next steps? There was a client that I worked with where the company had grown exponentially. So they'd gone from 100 employees to 500 employees, and they brought me on because they were having certain challenges bringing on customers. And so when I came on board, one of the first things that I do is I do an audit and an assessment of where they're at. And I found that because the teams had grown so exponentially, that those learning loops had been kind of lost along the way. And so one, the customer facing team, as the things that they were learning was not being translated to the clinical team. And so that's kind of like where things had fallen off a little bit. So regardless of where you are in the growth of the company, it's always important to have those learning loops. So it's good to kind of assess where you are right now.
So if you're trying to build out or grow that ecosystem, I think the first thing you should be doing is auditing who you have. So at the beginning of the talk, we talked about like maybe you have 10 pilots sold, but only three are using. Well, the first thing to do is to interview those customers. So to interview the three people who are using it, why do they value it? How have they integrated it into their workflow? Because what you might think is what how they will integrate is very different than what they're using, and you can learn from them and say, oh, actually, that's a better idea. And you could be talking to the people who are not integrating. That interview process is also a sales and branding exercise. It's always important, I think, to be talking to at least your sales lead, if not your sales team, because they're the ones who are really having the most interaction with your leads and prospects. So what they learn from that customer is really very important. But it's also through the interview process, you're training the sales team to pay attention to the things that biz development, product development, and marketing might need, like the kind of intel we would need to then build out our initiatives. And then, of course, talking to your patient support, to your training team, again, they will have really great insight into how your end user is value, how they use your product and what they value. Also from a marketing perspective and from like my old copywriter hat, finding out like the words they use, the phrases they use to describe your product, how your end user would describe your product will tell you a lot about what your product is to them and what the value really is to them. And then the second step would be to align your team. So getting product marketing and sales and training in one room will be a great way to identify the friction points in your adoption cycle and to also pinpoint opportunities to amplify your message and to create better engagement and connection with your patients, with your buyers, and the like. So those two things, an audit and an alignment are, your first two steps.
And then step three is then to redistribute your insights. So once you do step one and step two, out of that will come like different insights that you want to implement. So our recommendation is take one insight and then flow it into multiple places. So as an example, let's say, and this is something that I've worked on, sales will mention, well, as we're going out and selling, we realized that we don't have a quick like 30-second demo video to show our customers what the value is of our product. And so then if you work on developing that 30-second video, and then not just having sales use it, but then using that to then think about training can use that and say, well, what are the insights that what was important in this video? Can we turn that into a longer training to talk about features? Include that 30-second video in the onboarding email. Marketing can use that on the website. And so any type of insight or asset that's being created or outcome from this alignment, making sure that you're using that in multiple places so that every team can benefit from it. And then step four is to measure. So once you implement that insight, looking at the metrics before and after to see, hey, did this move the needle? Did this help us with our customers? And see what can be learned from that, and then sort of start the process over and work on the next insight. All right. So we're happy to take any questions. Does anybody have any questions they'd like? Feel free to come off mute and ask. Hi, Laura.
Hi, how's everything going? I'm just gonna see if I pronounce right your name, sorry. It's Mansi.
Muncie, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Mansi and Kelly, thank you so much for your presentation. This is first time hearing this type of presentation. Sorry in advance if the terminology of the words or sorry, my cat, it's really
Oh, that's okay.
overly attached. I'm so sorry. That's what I had turned off the camera in the beginning. I just wanted to be sure about education, when you slide in education. I think education is just not about the physician. I think it's also the medical teams. And when we're speaking about consumers, I think patients are also the type of
Hmm.
consumers that we need to take account. Which would you consider that we prioritize? For example, the patients or the medical team, for example, as medical devices, because it's not just going to be the physician that is using it, it's also going to see the patient that is using it. So, for example, nasal strips so you can breathe better.
Hmm.
Should I focus into patients that they are going to use it or in the medical team as, for example, residents, that I think
Hmm.
it's a really big population area that we need to take into account? Or, for example, medical assistants or nurses, like which ones should I choose to focus first? So we're going to say, like, oh, this, my education is going to be better in this place.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And Laura, you brought up a good point. So and that's something that I see often is when we talk about customer, it's not just one customer. There's multiple customers. And so you cannot, to exactly what you're saying, build the same training for each of them. So to answer your question, I would say start with the person that's making the decision. So, for example, if it's the doctor telling the patient you have to use this medical strip, and the patient kind of, sometimes you go along with what the doctor's saying because the doctor is the one making the recommendation. So if the doctor is the one that's sort of pushing the adoption, I would focus on them and educating them about like training them on this strip, let's say the benefits, things like that. If, let's say, the patient is the one making the decision, then patient education is slightly different because you want to include more stuff on your website, make things more freely available, kind of build sort of a resource base for them so that you still want to focus on the physician, but you might have to spend a little bit more time on the patients and having more information available so that the physician can say, hey, go refer to the website for additional information because the patient is the one ultimately making the decision. So I would say it depends on who's making that decision about the adoption of the device. Focus on them first. And the other thing that I also uh, when I work with companies, we talk about it's not just about educating the physicians in this case, but it's also empowering them. So it's not about just like you give them the training, but what do they need to then go out and talk to other people about like about the product. So for example, like you do a training session with the physician. What else do they need? Do they need like a marketing flyer? Do they need a video that they can then share with their peers? So kind of thinking about them as every person that you train is your champion. What do I need to empower them to then become our voice? And looking at it that way. And so kind of also developing things as part of that training that you can give to them and say, hey, here's a package of different things that you can take now and go and talk to other people about what we're offering.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. Well, here is my information and Kelly's information. So please connect with us on LinkedIn. If you want to book, I offer free 20-minute strategy calls. You can go on my website and book a strategy call. We can talk through, any challenges that you're having, and I can offer some advice. And Kelly's information is there as well. So thank you so much for coming, and it was so nice to meet all of you. Any last words, Kelly?
No, I think that covers it as well. Yeah, more than happy to give people. We just have a book of fit call. So if you have any questions about marketing or branding, more than happy to get on a call with you. And good luck to everybody as you build out these very important businesses. I'm always happy to work with people in healthcare because what you do is actually really important. So thank you for doing it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.